Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Fire University, hosted by Marcus Lashley.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today, I have Dr. Donovan with me, and she has recently joined the University of Florida faculty and seems to be really interested in fire ecology and fire management, fire science, and also has done some work with large herbivores, which I immediately was keen to look at. So thanks for coming to visit with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So when did you start at the university?
I started mid-August.
Oh, okay. So now we're in mid-October, just a few months ago.
Yeah, no, it's not been long. I'm still learning the ropes.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I did it twice, actually. I started at Mississippi State and then started over again at University of Florida. So once wasn't enough for me, I guess.
Right, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your program?
Yeah, sure. So I actually am originally from Canada. So I did my master's work up in the boreal forests of Ontario. And then I came down to Nebraska for my PhD with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Did a postdoc there as well, studying wildfire and fire dynamics. And then I migrated down this way. So I'm just leaving the snow behind and looking for some warmer weather. And, I'm just starting to develop my research program here. But I'm really focused on understanding fire dynamics from kind of two perspectives, both understanding fire as a disturbance process and how we can manage systems to prevent wildfire damage, and also understanding fire as a really important and fundamental feedback within almost all of our terrestrial systems, or a lot of our terrestrial systems, and kind of how we can use fire to enhance resilience of our systems and enhance natural resource production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of similarities with things I'm interested in. Well, also, we do have snow every few decades here, so you didn't necessarily leave it behind, but
well, that's good. I'm not gonna lie, I love snow. I love it. So I plan on, going back up north around Christmas time to get a little fix of snow, and then I'll come back down to the beach.
Yeah, I hear you. A lot of people do the opposite. They come down here during the winter and enjoy the nice weather, get away from the cold.
Yeah, my family were my grandparents especially were a bunch of snowbirds, so I'm quite familiar.
Yeah, so you may have family come down to visit you from Canada from time to time then.
I'm already booked for most of January. Our spare bedroom is booked up. We're gonna have to create a spreadsheet soon.
Yeah. A spreadsheet. Now that's a good, interesting way to go about it. Maybe I need to take some notes here.
I'll let you know how it goes. This will be our trial run for sign up.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to go ahead and get into some of the work that you've done. Me being really interested in wildlife management, was of course very interested in some of your large herbivore work, particularly the bighorn sheep work, but I think it overlaps quite a bit with several topics that we've gone over in the past on this podcast, just related to heterogeneity in general, and how I guess fire naturally moves heterogeneously through plant communities and across the landscape, and that can also generate heterogeneity, which I'd commonly talk to people about the importance of from a wildlife habitat standpoint. So I was curious if you wanted to tell us a little bit about some of that work.
Yeah, so I guess to give a little bit of a background on my interest related to that and to wildlife is when I did my master's degree, I was actually studying boreal caribou and their responses to forest management. And so there was new management guidelines that were introduced up north for managing caribou. So basically, previously, before these management guidelines, we were cutting in these small harvest blocks, and this was causing, we had an increase in prey species like deer and moose moving up into boreal forests, and then that brought in wolf, a higher abundance of wolf, which were then picking off the caribou populations in the boreal forest. So it created this really interesting predator-prey dynamic, and we basically saw that as forest harvesting moved farther north, we just saw the population of caribou moving with it. So the populations were just getting decimated. And so they created these new harvesting guidelines focused on natural disturbance emulation, where they wanted to mimic wildfires in the boreal forest with how they harvested. And so this was changing the shape and structure of the harvest blocks to have these kind of large and patchy harvest blocks. And then they were also using different silvicultural practices to try to replicate a stand replacing fire following harvest. And I was studying how caribou were responding to this change in forest harvesting dynamics. And that's where I really became interested in fire, because it became clear to me that there was so much heterogeneity within a fire perimeter, that there was so much complexity to how fire functioned and structured an ecosystem. And we just didn't really fully understand that. And so it was making it challenging to manage for these species without a full understanding of that. And so that's why I pursued my PhD looking at fire, and why I've kind of maintained, even though a lot of the time now I look at things from an ecosystem perspective, I really maintained a strong interest in, some of these larger ungulate species and how they're responding to fire dynamics. And so a really long explanation to say, yeah, I did some work on bighorn sheep.
And now we're there. Well, before we jump into the work, you said one thing several things, but one thing that I wanted to emphasize that I think is really interesting, and maybe a interesting perspective that people might benefit from. When I teach a habitat management course, and I commonly present, I guess, topics or practices in view of how they mimic some natural process. And we have quite a few silvicultural practices, or, just general habitat management practices where the disturbance by intent or by accident is actually mimicking really well something that would have naturally been occurring in the system. Some that come to mind are like in the South, at least, like a beetle spot, that's pretty similar to an uneven aged silviculture approach, like group selection. We have thinning, which could be really similar to fire or wind damage or something like that. We have all these practices that we implement. Obviously, prescribed fire is mimicking natural fire, but I just think it's a really interesting way to look at it, that a lot of the practices that you might implement on your property for whatever your objectives are or, on the landscape for whatever objectives, often we are intentionally trying to mimic some sort of natural process in that system. And, I think that's really interesting. It sounds like even during your master's work, that's really where that was born from, was that same idea that you're trying to mimic those natural processes. Really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think the goal up there was to kind of have, well, it was recognizing the role of disturbance and its value to the system, and trying to figure out how we can have, as minimal impact as possible while still, extracting what we need from that system. And so it's really shaped, I guess, a lot of my research going forward, as I said. So
yeah, really cool. Well, can you tell us about the Bighorn sheep work?
Yeah, I can. So, I with the Bighorn sheep, a lot of my research, my past research, was interested in patterns in fire severity. So a lot of the time when we think of fire, we think of fire as, it's a place is burned or it's unburned. But within a fire, you can have all of these varying patterns in fire intensity and other fire behaviors that then have differing outcomes on the ecosystem, which we measure as fire severity. So, if you have high severity fire, you have pretty drastic changes to the ecosystem structure, whereas if you have a low severity fire, you're seeing less of an impact. And so when I was thinking about bighorn sheep, I had been talking to some managers out in Wyoming, and they were applying prescribed burns to try to enhance the habitat that they had there for reintroduced populations of bighorn sheep. They were trying to get them back out in the Ferris Seminole Mountains. And they had a study done where they were looking to see whether these prescribed burns that they were applying were having positive impacts on the bighorn sheep. And they weren't really seeing, in terms of habitat selection, that they were utilizing or really benefiting from those patches. And so when I talked to them about that, I said, well, what's the pattern in fire severity? What does that look like in terms of your prescribed burns? And the location was really unique because it had also had some wildfires out there as well that had burned at a lot higher severity. And so it provided this opportunity to kind of look at some of these low and moderate severity prescribed burns and some of these more heterogeneous wildfires. And so that's where the study interest really came from, was, is the low severity fire that you're applying with prescribed burns, is that enough? Or, would they benefit more if we had, some of this higher intensity fire moving through some of these spots? So basically we did a habitat selection study. We looked at responses across multiple scales. And then we also looked at interactions between fire severity and time since fire. And what we found was that bighorn sheep were positively associated with both the low severity fire and the high severity fire, but that there were these strong interactions with time since fire and fire severity, and that actually differed among the different sexes. So male sheep were, let me double check, were we're more likely to use high severity burned areas immediately after fire, so with a lower time since fire, whereas female sheep were more likely to use those high severity burned areas with greater time since fire. So there was this kind of unique dynamic that was going on between the sexes, where they were clearly utilizing those areas for different reasons, but they were also clearly selecting for both low and high severity fire, and so they were getting different. There was something unique about the habitat characteristics in those locations that were providing them with different resources. And so it emphasized to us the importance of this heterogeneity, both within a single fire perimeter, but also then that interaction with time since fire. And it also, helps to explain when you see female sheep, which is what we tend to track when we're looking for movement behavior. They weren't using fires right away as much. And so that helps to explain when you're looking at your outcomes only 1 to 2 years after treatment. It just wasn't enough time to track the responses. And so that was an important finding as well.
That's really interesting. So just so that I have a good vision, I guess, of what it looked like there. So what does it look like after a high severity fire?
So the high severity classification that we used was based on MTBS. And so that's the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity database. So it's all based on remotely sensed information. And they're basically looking at the amount of change that occurs before fire versus after. And a lot of it is based on trees. So the higher severity fires, we can generally say are having a larger impact on tree mortality and shrub mortality. So a lot of that woody vegetation is being cleared out.
So the high severity is like a stand replacing type of event.
Yeah, it would be closer to stand replacing. Now, I specifically actually did not go out and measure post vegetation characteristics or after these fires. It wasn't something that I did. I know that the managers out there have done it, but I can't say firsthand exactly what it looked like. Now, they probably told me, we talked about it, I'm sure, when I did the study. But
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, there is issues with, and in a lot of places I've worked, there's issues with woody encroachment. And so with that high severity fire, killing off some of those trees is definitely a big thing in terms of bighorn sheep.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that is interesting to me, I've been out in that part of the world in multiple states several times, and I always have a keen eye for what it looks like after fire there. And I recall being in Montana within the last couple of years, multiple times where we saw a wildfire, that was high severity like that. And then I'm looking at it and it's like, if this was in Florida, this fire happened 2 months ago. That's what it looks like in terms of the vegetation response and everything. And then one of the local people that I was with, he was like, oh yeah, that was in 2012. It was like 9 years ago. It's like, wait, what? It's like, but the vegetation response is so delayed in comparison to what I'm used to. But that starts to make sense when you're talking about time since fire. The numbers that jump into my head are quite a bit shorter in terms of time from what the response that you were probably observing in that study.
Right. And that's something that I'm coming to terms with moving down here, because, in the other place where I spend a lot of time researching and where I know a lot about the ecosystems is in these eastern ponderosa pine forests in western Nebraska. So pretty close to these sites in Wyoming as well. And, we studied legacies of fire, and we're looking 27 years post-fire, and snags, coarse woody debris, the load, it's huge there, in places where they haven't treated. And I'm talking to people down here that say coarse woody debris, why would you even measure it? It doesn't last down here. So that's really interesting.
Well, yeah, I remember distinctly one time the pattern also is really interesting, how important aspect was. And like, the southwest part of every slope is always a moonscape essentially from fire. And then the northeast was moist and still forested. And that was always something that was really interesting to me because it, just gives you a different perspective when you get out west. But yeah, some of those high intensity fires, there were still snags standing, and it was like that. This fire was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's like that snag
Yeah.
would have been down 3 months from now, in the south.
Right.
So yeah, it is really interesting getting that different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the same, we tracked in the Pine Ridge region of Nebraska, we tracked patterns in all sorts of different things post-fire. And 27 years post-fire, we still had snags standing. We were looking for patterns in cavities, and we looked at cavity nesting birds, and yeah, there's still tons of coarse woody debris, still snags standing. Yeah, it just sounds like that type of legacy is not something that you would see. So it'd be interesting to see, I'm interested to find out down here what the legacies are, do they really disappear, or do you still see kind of those long-term outcomes, represented in vegetation structure and community? And yeah, because the ghost of the forest from high severity fire that was there was just still sitting there almost 30 years post-fire where I worked previously. So
yeah, so I'm just thinking about that. Yeah, 30 years since fire, the stand replacing fire, and you're still seeing the legacy of it. I'm thinking, okay, in the south we could clear cut, we literally do clear cut a pine forest, replant it, and then clear cut it again at at the end of the rotation in that same time period. So it is substantially different. But in terms of the legacy, maybe the legacy doesn't last as long, but there's certainly, in my experience, quite a legacy from the difference in sunlight penetration to the forest floor. So that, a canopy gap that's created, from a disturbance of whatever sort, whether you applied it or not, the light is the limiting factor at the understory level in our forested systems in the south. So if you're reducing the canopy cover in an area from above 85 or 90% cover down to below that, at least below 80, but even on down into the 30 or 40% cover, you may have a really long legacy in terms of the changes in plant community structure and composition that are associated with that increased light availability. And especially when it's interacting with fire, the recurring frequent fire, which I guess is another thing that's probably different. Is your frequent fire out in those study areas may have still been decades long, whereas here it's we literally might have places that are burning on an annual basis in some cases.
Right. Yeah, I mean, historically, no, I can't speak to the sagebrush areas in Wyoming, but we in Nebraska, we still would have had relatively frequent fire return intervals historically. In the Pine Ridge area, they just started putting prescribed fire on the ground when I was there. I don't think they were using it before that I'm aware of. So I'm guessing they're still playing around with what return interval they're going to use, but it was still pretty frequent in the grassland areas, and that would have kind of migrated up into these, these ponderosa pine. They're kind of like, you've got these big rocky buttes, and then you've got, all that topography creates a space for the forest to persist. And then you kind of got those frequent grassland fires that would have kind of just migrated in some points and kept it more of that savanna stand structure. But yeah, I mean, they would have been frequent, lower intensity, and then we think, we argue in some of our work that there would have been mixed severity, maybe less frequent, but mixed severity fires moving through those ponderosa pine stands as well.
Yeah, it's just interesting the parallels, and we're really just sort of expanding or contracting the time scale in a lot of ways, at least in some of the systems. But I'm immediately thinking about the parallels, and the heterogeneity sounds like is really important, and that, that's the same thing that we would be thinking about here, especially if you have an objective of many species. So you're trying to conserve many wildlife or plant species, the diversity and disturbance promotes diversity, across other species. So yeah, it seems like there are some concepts that overlap pretty well.
Yeah. And I think it's just important to understand, and I think this is an eye-opening move for me, just kind of reinforces that the dynamics of each system is so different. But yeah, there's these kind of overarching themes too that, just are important to understand for every system. And I think a lot with fire, that I've seen is it kind of gets generalized across systems, rules kind of get generalized across systems, and it just plays such similar but different roles, and you really have to understand, how it functions in each different system. This is cool.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. There's something about actually in the habitat course we got to burn the other day, last class period that we were in, and I was standing there and one of the students asked me what I like about it, and it was hard to answer that, but at the moment I was really enjoying how it smelled. Like we were just, we had lit a backing fire and we were in the smoke, and I was just sort of like basking in it, like in appreciation of what the fire smelled like. And it's like, man, I really do miss this. Because I don't get out on fires as much as I used to. So I definitely was enjoying it when I did get the chance.
Right.
But you're right, it is just cool. There were so many things to point out, while the fire was going. It didn't do that well in terms of meeting our objectives, but it was a really good learning opportunity from a whole suite of perspectives. So it worked out in the end. But yeah, definitely reminded me, and it does every time that I'm on one, how much I enjoy just observing and learning and admiring the processes that are going on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, I've got friends that are, on the ground, fire. One of my friends stops every time we're walking or hiking and takes a selfie if there's prescribed fire, in the background. She's, oh, someone's burning. She's just so jazzed about it. And, I love being out and seeing fire, but and it's why I was laughing earlier about, how not tech savvy I am, but I use tech all the time because I get so excited. For me, it's the landscape scale and the structuring. It just shapes so much of the landscape. You can just see these echoes of fire that just shape everything, and it's just so cool. And I just find it amazing, especially, since we don't often think about it. If you look at a lot of management plans, we've done some work looking at that. Even how we label landscapes, something's a forest, something's a grassland, but if you consider the disturbance dynamics, it's something totally, that grassland is not just a grassland, that forest is not just a forest. There's so much complexity that's shaped across the landscape just by a fire that, may have burned. We'll see how long it lasts around here. I'm really interested in that, but may have burned 50 years ago, out west or in the Great Plains, and it's still totally structuring the communities there, the wildlife communities, the vegetation communities.
Yeah. Well, I think about 50 years ago since fire, and it's like, wow, okay, that now it's an oak forest.
Right. Yeah.
Stand replacing fire, but now it's an oak forest.
Right.
Yeah, quite different. And I know that you've gone around and looked at quite a few sites, so you're getting a feel for that. if you didn't
Yeah,
have
it's
it
been
beforehand,
interesting hearing. Yeah, like I think when I was out at Austin Cary Forest, we were talking about when trees were planted and how old they were, and
hmm
I was just kind of amazed at, how how the stands looked that were so young, and they were
hmm
talking about harvesting every 40 years. And when I was in the boreal forest, I think it was 80-year cycles, but it really should have been 120-year harvest
hmm
cycles to really get, to get old growth forest for caribou, you needed at least 120 years old.
Yeah,
It's just so
outside of our
boggling to
lifetime.
me that, down here is just so, anyway,
Yeah,
so
you,
different.
you you need like 4 careers uh, before you cut.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're never gonna, anyone who's implementing management up there is never gonna see, like, reap the full rewards of what they
hmm
created, whereas down here you can plant a stand and cut it down again. That's
Yeah, yeah,
mind-boggling.
really crazy. Well, and I'm thinking, okay, let's go to especially some of the more productive regions like the Red Hills where Tall Timbers is. Let's go 50 days after fire and you see see whether or not you can tell which place just burned. It's just
Right.
the vegetation response is so fast in those productive high sunlight, high moisture, uh, highly productive soils in the South. I mean, it literally, it may be waist high or taller in the understory already, just from the responses from the plants. It's so fast, just in a
Yeah,
few
I couldn't
months.
get over that in Tall Timbers, really. They were showing me those plots where it was burned every year, every second, every third, every fourth year. And,
hmm
by every fourth year, it looked like it'd never been burned.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, if you
nuts.
get to 5, it gets away. Like you
Yeah,
can't get it back. Yeah,
right.
it is a pretty incredible. So I think all that's really awesome, and there's definitely some parallels. I was curious, what do you think you're going to work on here? Like, is there something exciting that you've already keyed in on that you think you're going to try to tackle?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I'm kind of coming from two different perspectives. One, I'm interested in wildfires kind of from that the risk perspective, but also for the outcomes,
hmm
because I'm so interested in the heterogeneity when we're not controlling fire behavior in a safe manner, like we do with prescribed fires. You can kind of see that full range of outcomes. And so um, a lot of what I've started doing is studying wildfire regime characteristics across actually the entire East right now. I'm just looking at patterns and changes, where fires are happening, when they're happening, what are they being ignited by,
hmm
and then leaning into what the outcomes are. What are some patterns and severity? What are they doing to the vegetation, kind of at a landscape scale? So that's one angle that I'm interested in, just to kind of get a foundation for myself, I guess, on how I view systems.
hmm
And then, the other thing is, like we've been talking about, I'm interested in that time since fire and fire severity interaction and dynamic. And what does that look like down here? And, how is that shaping communities and structures and resilience, particularly across scales? If we look at
hmm
an individual patch that burned at high severity, well, how does that patch play into the larger landscape and what we're seeing with that wildfire dynamic? And so, yeah, I've got some ads out now for graduate students to come work on kind of
Yeah.
that fire severity, fire refugia. And I'm going to be interviewing soon, and I just hope I don't scare them away, because it's like, I'm just really excited. I've got like a million ideas for what we could look at. And anyway,
Yeah.
I spoke with one already, and I was like, tone it down.
You need to be excited, but not to don't
Yeah,
be
I don't
scary.
know, overwhelm them. Here's all the things we could do. Like, I just want to do
Yeah.
a master's
Yeah.
thesis.
I think you should have 30 chapters.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I saw that you had advertised some positions. They looked really interesting. Yeah, and it is also interesting for me to think about because that your approach is different than mine is, which is great. We need people that are doing things in different ways and different spatial and temporal scales and all that. I think that's critical for science just in general. But it was interesting to start thinking through some of the processes that you're looking at, like across the east, and then a lot of the time I'm like narrowing it down all the way to an experimental unit,
Right.
an individual stand, because I typically am pretty experimental in the work that I do. But and then thinking about the fire refugia, one of the interesting projects that I'm kind of getting started on is with gopher tortoises, and they're influencing at a real local scale how fire behaves, and it's actually probably reverberating into the structure of the vegetation. And yeah, it's just a really interesting dynamic at a different spatial scale than you're looking at, because that literally may be a fire shadow that's 10 or 15 meters across. It's not that big
Right.
in comparison, but when you multiply that times tens of thousands of them across the landscape, it could become pretty interesting for the way that it drives the dynamics in that system, even at the landscape scale.
Right. And so I'll have to talk to you about what you find for that, because I'm really interested in what's happening at that little scale that feeds up into the bigger scale, and similarly what's happening at those larger scales that's feeding back down, and how's that structuring the outcomes of the fire. And it's funny because I came down here and I was asking about coarse woody debris for that, shaping those fine scale refugia, because where I'd worked previously, if you have a tree seedling, you want to plant it right by its own little piece of coarse woody debris, protect it from a low intensity fire, provides it with moisture, all those. And I thought, oh, well, maybe this is kind of playing an important role in stand dynamics here. And it seems like probably not, considering coarse woody debris is not really hanging around. But yeah, I'm really interested in that. That's really neat. So what are they doing to, how are they creating refuges? It's just the way that they're removing vegetation?
Well, I think part of it is that part of it is they're excavating, a burrow and keeping it fresh, and I guess potentially multiple ones for an individual even. But that at a really small scale is affecting the vegetation, I guess, really local to that, because you have like an apron that isn't devoid of plants, but it's really low plant density. And then another thing, they are an herbivore, so they're eating plants, and you can certainly see from their paths, especially they seem to have like a favorite path they walk. So you end up with this trail, or usually 2 or 3 trails where they're sort of like a small break-in fuel.
Oh, cool.
Where sort of like a little fire break they've created.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is one thing I'm very interested in is their seed dispersers. So they're the central place forager, and they're going out and getting seeds from plants, grasses, or even eating fleshy fruit off of forbs and broadleaf plants, and then bringing them back and depositing them in the disturbed soil in this nice little packet of nutrients, around their burrow. So you can, some work has shown that they even have an influence on which plants are composing the plant community around their burrow. Right. So it's kind of interesting when you start adding those things together, and then that plays into how the fire behaves, which then reverberates into which plants are successful. So it's definitely this full circle interaction that I think is just really fascinating. And I know that I get excited about it, and audience knows me well enough, probably if they listen to a few of these episodes, that I always seem to get on this topic of, how wildlife are feeding back into this process. And all of my students that are working with fire are working on something like this, where we're looking at wildlife responding to a disturbance, and then that response is actually, I guess, modulating the outcomes in terms of the plant community.
Right.
And I think most people think of wildlife being in sort of like an end product of what happens. So you burn, and then you get some vegetation, and then wildlife respond to that.
Yeah.
Whereas my viewpoint on is that that's obviously true, but them responding to it and eating it and carrying it around and doing all those things also affects the outcome. So they're an important part of it. So, but same thing with herbivory. I've been working with deer, not bighorn sheep, but I was
Right.
immediately interested in your work with the bighorns because of my work with deer. I'm looking at, their response to fire, and then, the top-down control of plants and selectivity and herbivory, and how all those things could generate heterogeneity in the response. It's very
Right.
similar, just a different scale to what you're talking about.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, I thought about just to, when I was working in Nebraska, one of the biggest, a big risk that I'll say one of the biggest risks that they have out there is woody encroachment.
Mhm.
They've got, losing the microphone here. There, eastern red cedar trees that are invading. It's a native invader, and it's encroaching, creating these massive monocultures of eastern red cedar. And we found that woody vegetation is strongly tied to wildfire risk out there. And it makes sense, if you have woody vegetation burning, you're going to have much more extreme fire behaviors. And I haven't worked on this well, I have a little bit, but birds play an important role in distributing cedar trees. And so people think a lot about, cedar, and, we talk about maybe it's spread from a patch, how it is gradually spreading outward. But that birds can carry these seeds over huge distances and disperse them and start a whole new invasion somewhere else. And anyway, I guess if you think about it that way, they're spreading fire risk, plopping those cedar seeds, maybe right by your home or whatever. So their importance, it's such a small little thing, but they play a huge role in then shaping your fire risk and the fire dynamics on the landscape. So yeah, anyway, I thought about that when you told me kind of what some of the work.
No, I'm with you on that. The same thing, similar ideas where, everywhere you have a fence, that's a perch, and then you're going to have woody encroachment associated with the seed dispersal to that perch.
Fence and power lines.
Yeah. One of my graduate students, he's defended now, so he will soon be Dr. Mason. He was tracking seed dispersal by the bird community as it related to fire, and it was really, really cool. But we were looking at it completely differently. Again, a lot of the wildlife plants that are highly desirable are consumed by birds and animal dispersed seeds, and he was actually tracking how fire affected their behavior and where they brought seeds to. And it turns out that they basically are attracted to recent burns, and that skews seed dispersal into the burned area, which is probably a pretty good place to get established. So that work has been really eye-opening for me, trying to figure out that whole process. And it's certainly, we have to treat all of the, that we can't just focus on part of the food web, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
The whole food web is interacting. That's why we call it a web, right? So
yeah.
It's just been really interesting to look at that. And a lot of the plants that are arriving are things that are highly desirable.
Right.
They're what you're trying to get to arrive there.
Right.
or to grow. They're plants that you're trying to stimulate with the burn to begin with.
Right. Yeah, they all play an important role. And that's actually, you just reminded me. So, working in the Pine Ridge, one of the studies we did was looking at ponderosa pine regeneration following high intensity fire. And we found some natural regeneration, but also we tracked just pine cones. And we were trying to see, okay, how many are in some of these burned areas, and for the potential for seeds to get in here. And yeah, you'd see no other pine trees around for however long, and there'd just be pine cone sitting in there, and it's like, who brought this here? And it probably plays such an important role in
Yeah.
the reestablishment of ponderosa pine. And I have no idea who did it.
Right.
But it would be interesting to know.
Yeah. Well, it's just cool to think about, how these processes all play together, into the ultimate dynamics that we're trying to measure and that we see play out on the landscape, and then realize, oh, actually there was a mouse and a beetle that were extremely critical for this whole function. It's like something weird.
Right.
The one that started really resonating with me when I started kind of diving into the seed dispersal literature, and I realized that when you have a canopy gap form, all of a sudden you increase seed rain into that canopy gap. And it's like this mechanism for all these species to colonize this new gap. And it just, like, a tree dies and it automatically stimulates this process. And it's just really wild to think about,
Right.
how nature works.
Yeah. It's cool. There's so many pieces. I think that's my head always gets. I just get jazzed about it, I guess. But
Yeah.
with fire, is the vegetation structure shaping, or what role is that playing in shaping fire, and what role is fire playing? They're so intertwined that it's hard to tell. And then you add in other elements like wildlife, like grazers that come in and play an important role in the dynamic, and how much of it is the fire shaping their movements and how much of it is them shaping fire. And
Yeah. Maybe they're all of the disturbance.
well, yeah, right.
Yeah, that's really funny. Well, I think it's been great conversation and really fun talking to you, and I'm looking forward to working with you over a whole career full of awesome ideas, I hope. I always like to kind of close with some take-home messages. So I was wondering do you have any take-home that you'd like for the audience to think about?
Take home. I think my biggest message and understanding that I'm trying to get across, and understand for myself, is that fire is so much more than being burned or unburned. Really is this kind of heterogeneous process, and it functions across so many different scales, and so its outcomes are reverberated across a single patch, influencing with interacting with a single mouse, all the way up to an entire ecoregion. And we really just need to think broadly. I guess we all need to think broadly about fire, because it just does so much more than I think a lot of us give it credit for. Maybe not people listening to this podcast, but
Yeah. Yeah, they're definitely, based on the feedback, we have plenty of people that are in full appreciation of that whole process, the questions and comments and things that we get, which I love. Please keep it up. Send questions and comments, rate the podcast, all those things help us keep this thing going and expanding knowledge. But yeah, I think we're pretty safe on that comment that we have the audience that really appreciates it here. Yeah, so very cool stuff. Well, any other thoughts or things you wanted to close with?
I'm just excited to be here, and to keep learning about this area, and yeah, I just can't wait. That's probably about all.
Yeah, that's one of the awesome things about the position that we're in. So we are essentially getting paid to think and learn, and that's really awesome. And the people like yourself that end up in those positions are often the ones that are super excited about how awesome things are.
Right. Yeah, it's still mind-boggling for me that I'm here. I'm just very appreciative and excited. So
Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of folks out there might be really interested in the work that you do or getting in contact with you. Is there a good way that they can find you?
yeah, people can reach out to me via email. I'm happy to provide that. I've also got a website, and I'm listed on the UFF website as well. So please
Did you
feel
bring the
free to.
website with you, or have you made that since you've started?
I converted it from a personal
Oh,
website, so it's still just my name.
yeah. Well, I'm impressed. I've been here several years and I still don't have the website, which is amazing because we have like all the social media presence and podcasts and all that. I don't have a website. That's a landing page. So we're
Well,
working on it.
I wasn't on the UF website when I started advertising for positions, and I thought there must I don't want people to think this is a fake. I gotta create some kind of an online presence. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Enter your credit card number right here.
right, exactly.
Yeah, definitely don't want to do that. I was actually interviewing this past week and multiple candidates like, well, I was looking, I was trying to find this on your website, but I wasn't able to find it. And I was like, yeah, that's because there isn't a website. So okay, well, yeah, well, we can provide the contact information to your website and your email address. Was there anything? Maybe I missed something. That was what you said, right?
Yeah, that's probably the best way for people to reach out to me. And yeah, I'm excited always to talk about fire, and happy to hear from people in this area and other locations as well. I'm always happy to learn. So if people have feedback or thoughts, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I know we have a lot of enthusiastic listeners that are always inquisitive and trying to learn. So we'll put your contact information in the show notes, and also we'll put links to a couple of these manuscripts that you have published. If people are interested in looking at those, we try to make those available. But otherwise, it's been a real pleasure talking to you and getting to know you a little more. I know we've met once before, but it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, I'm happy to have been able to do this, and get to know you more as well. Hopefully we'll continue.
Yeah, for sure. All right, folks, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. And again, providing feedback, reaching out to us, rating the podcast, all those things are super helpful. It helps us get the word out to more people, and also try to cover topics that you all are interested in. So we really appreciate all of that. And until next time, we'll talk to you later. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.